Good evening. Tonight we are in Esther chapter 5, and I just found a mistake. Yes, go figure. Page 10 at the top of the page, it doesn't impact anything other than my ADD. Should say verse 9 through 14, not 12 through 14. So that might be, if you see other mistakes, please don't point them out to me. Just correct them on your own sheet, because that will affect my ADD. No, that's fine. Mistakes happen. I just was looking at it. I'm like, well, I'm missing some verses. No, all the verses are there. I just wrote it down wrong. So we're good. So we are in Esther chapter 5, kind of the midway point of the text when we complete chapter 5 tonight. There's 10 chapters. The 10th chapter almost seems like a summation. So this is truly that midpoint. And when we see how the book unfolds, you would probably agree that this is that climax, that suspenseful part where everything else begins to fall in place. Tonight, we're looking at the post-fast. Esther has agreed to go see the king, and she's asked her maidservants to pray, and she's asked Mordecai to pray, and asked Mordecai to solicit others in the city to pray. And in my research this week, I found a quote. I have no idea where it came from. I've heard it before, and maybe you've heard it too. But I thought it would be fitting. I wish I would have had it last week, but I think it draws good for an introduction this week. The quote goes something like this: "You can pray without fasting, but you cannot fast without prayer." There's some truth to that, because there's a dedicated purpose in fasting, which immediately is a prayer. So when you're fasting, you are praying. But you can pray without fasting, but you can't fast without prayer. The more I thought about it, the more of a truism it absolutely is. And so praying and fasting for 3 days, now we open up to Esther chapter 5. And I'm going to read the chapter, and then we'll kind of look at it and talk about some things. And we'll look at some larger concepts later on after we complete chapter 10, but we'll talk intermediate tonight about some things that we've noticed in the chapter. There's probably like 3 segments. I've only broke it down into like an introduction and then 2 parts. But we'll take a look at it tonight. Let's read it together. Again, I'm reading from the New King James. "Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, 'What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half of the kingdom.' And so Esther answered, 'If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him.' Then the king said, 'Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther has said.' And so the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, 'What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request after the half of the kingdom? It shall be done.' Then Esther answered and said, 'My petition and request is this: if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said.' And so Haman went out that day joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she has prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her, alone with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, then go merrily with the king to the banquet." And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Wow. Imagine the emotions, the ebb and flow of what's going on in this whole scenario. Here's Esther, I guess you could say eager, maybe even to the point of being anxious about approaching the king, because she knows how important the work that she's prepared to do really is. We see the response of the king, very gracious. We see the reaction of Haman when he leaves the banquet, and the immediacy of the emotions changing from one to the other. And then, obviously, the new plot. And so when we look at the book of Esther and we think about the microcosm of all that has already happened, not the events that have already happened and will happen, chapter 5 probably is a good summation. It's kind of like a review. If you missed episodes 1 through 4, just wait till episode 5, and now you get to kind of get a feel for what's going on. Here's Esther making her approach. She's in her royal garments. She approaches the king. Now, when we read chapter 3, her concern was that if the king did not accept her by ordinance, she was supposed to be put to death. It said not just her in particular, but anyone who approaches the king without an invitation, the king's servants are supposed to put them to death. And so Esther has to debate about this day coming. Here's the third day, and she has a plan. Now, who helped her develop the plan? It doesn't say, but she has a plan. She's going to go into the king, and she's going to invite him to a banquet. And it took me a little while to think about this banquet and why no request was particularly made during the first banquet and the invitation to the second banquet and the emotions that happened during that first banquet that seemed to accelerate the anticipation, even the anxiousness of what's going to happen on the morrow. And then we get to see all of those characters and their development getting ready for tomorrow. What's going to happen tomorrow? So do you think Esther had 3 sleepless nights? She might have been one of the few. Mordecai agreed to participate with the city, the Jews in the city, but we only see at this point Esther's response. On the third day, she prepares herself and she approaches the king's court in all of her splendor. Now, did she go in and knock on the door or talk to the servants? How did Esther approach the king? 2 things I noticed immediately. She makes an entrance, and then where does she place herself? Where does she place herself when she gets into the palace?
Straight view, so he has to see it.
Yeah. Remember, we said that what would you call it? I would, for the lack of a better term, like the compound of the king has gates that probably have inner rooms, preparation to enter, and then there's probably a courtyard that feeds off into maybe the servants' quarters and maybe the queen's quarters and maybe other places, or they might even actually be in a completely different location. But what we know here is the queen has approached the king in what is termed the king's palace, while he's sitting in preparation. What does it say? Sitting on his royal throne. So he's there as if maybe to be conducting business, or maybe he just wakes up like some folks and go to work and sit in the chair and wait for something to happen. Maybe that's what kings do. Anyway, he appears to be in a position where maybe some work is going to happen. And he's come in and he's sat on the throne, and maybe he's waiting to see, okay, basically bring who's next or what's on the agenda today. And in the meantime, kind of like out in the foyer, he's sitting here and he sees the queen. Maybe she passed by once and got his attention, passed by and just stood there and maybe not even looking at him. It doesn't say necessarily. So the queen was standing in the court, that she found favor in the king's sight. Doesn't say that she made eye contact with him necessarily. So she could have been being somewhat passive, but yet the king noticed her. So it seems to me to answer the question why the king asked like he did. Please bring the queen in. She knows the responsibility. He knows if he doesn't extend the scepter to her, he's probably violating his own law. So he extends the scepter to her. She touches it. How can I help you? How can I serve you? Whatever you want, up to the half of my kingdom, it'll be yours. You know, it took me a little while to even figure out why the king would have asked that without any kind of introduction, without, obviously the queen is there for a reason, right? She has some business before the king. But my little BB brain and everything about it, it took me a little while to how does the king know she wants something? Well, it kind of, for some people, it probably just made sense. For me, I had to think about it. And it says here that, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to the half of the kingdom. Where else have we heard phrases like that? Yeah. Here, I'm going to give you half of whatever I've got. Or you can have it all. In this particular case, the term I would use is hyperbole or exaggeration, knowing that the queen's not going to ask more, maybe out of duty. She's going to ask what she needs, and the king is fully prepared to say, kind of like Herod, here, sweetheart, whatever you want, right? Is that, and Charlene was, I didn't mean to steal your thunder because you might have been fixing to say the same thing.
Sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
This theme, like Herod, the king had an eye for beautiful women, and she knew that. That's why she was there. Mm-hmm. So you can just imagine as she's prepping, she's like, okay, I got to look as good as I got to fix my hair, got to get the right clothes, catch his eye. And apparently it worked because he was like, oh, yeah, whatever you want, honey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how many days has it been since she has been to see the king? So over a month. In chapter 4, we made sure that we mentioned that she's not been invited to the king's court in over a month. Go ahead, Dave.
I think as I think about this scene, it's as significant to me what she doesn't do as what she does. And I picture this, not her strutting in, going, hey, I'm the queen, you better let me in, or approaching up by his side like she belonged there. It just says she's out in the court. Mm-hmm. It's like she positioned herself so the eye contact would be made, but there's no presumption. There's no taking on of airs or assuming that it's going to be the way that...
She didn't just march right into the throne. Yeah, which she knew that she was not allowed to do that. So that brings up an interesting thought, and I didn't have it in my notes, but I had thought about that. She's come to that part of the palace maybe with the hopes that if he doesn't see me, then I just know, or he does see me and he turns away, then I know he hasn't accepted me, then maybe I can get away without dying. Because she obviously in chapter 4, she was fearful for her life, not the duty she needed to perform. If I ask the king and he says no, that's not what she was concerned about. She was ultimately concerned about, can I even approach him without potentially losing my life? So maybe that the little, what do you call it? The little beauty walk that she did in some respects was she's testing it. What kind of mood's he in today? Is he going to receive me in? It's been a month. And if we know the culture, and we'll see a little bit of this in chapter 6 and chapter 7, there's some things that happen that have a cultural explanation. We've already talked a little bit about the king, and the king is not always about the business outside of the palace. So if she's not invited in, he's doing other business. She may not know she surely doesn't know his business, and he doesn't necessarily concern himself with her business. So this is kind of like, it's almost like a new date. It's been 30 days. You think we could have a date? Kind of, can I come see you? Can we have dinner kind of thing? And that's why when we read the next section, it makes a little more sense. And here's the way I would explain this next section, because basically she says, please come to the banquet I prepared for you and for Haman. That's a revelation. So whatever's happened in this 3 days, this prayer and preparation, somehow Haman has become involved. Someone's counseled her. She's made the decision on her own. Something's happened, because it doesn't suggest anything like when you pray and fast, generally you isolate yourself. So I don't know who Esther's been talking to. It doesn't say that Mordecai came in, because Mordecai's over here doing the same thing. So somehow, and we'll talk about this when we get to the end, we'll talk a little bit about how providence works, because we don't have any of the answers. We just have suppositions. But evidently, for some reason, she decided it was necessary to invite Haman. And it'll make more sense, obviously, when we get to the banquet in the next chapter. But listen to verse number 4 again. So Esther answered, if it pleases the king, in other words, obviously it's up to you. Let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. It's an interesting phrase when you think about it, and that's what we're doing in the book of Esther. Somebody asked me, said, how can you spend a whole hour in one chapter? Because we're thinking about what's happening and not just reading the words. And so some people might think it's taking too long, and some might say it's not taking long enough. But we're going to talk about some of the larger concepts at the end. So when we think about this banquet, it makes sense when we read the next verse how it almost appears as if, this is my supposition, it almost appears as if, well, I'm just going to do finger foods, and if he comes, then I'll invite him again tomorrow to the big feast. Why put on a big feast and then embarrass yourself, or it doesn't happen and you end up dying, and so let's test the waters a little bit. Let's invite him over for tea and crumpets kind of thing, invite him over for the afternoon brunch. And if he agrees to that, then maybe I can convince him to come back tomorrow. That's how I saw the verse. But she was eager to make sure that the invitation was there, and to see how the king felt about that. Then I'm sure overnight, she's got to pray about what's going to happen tomorrow, and we'll see that next week. But then the king said, bring Haman quickly. So remember, it's been about 5 years since Esther was queen that Haman was made, one translation even said, I think it was Revised Standard, even said prime minister. Or maybe it was the commentator of that standard version, said prime. So inviting hurry, go get the prime minister and bring him here. We've got somewhere we need to be. Do it quickly, bring Haman. So evidently, obviously it's been a little while, but the queen knows Haman, obviously. And now the king obviously knows Haman. So it should not be a surprise that his next in line, notice on the outline, was it an afterthought or intentional? I'll say it was intentional. She intended somewhere overnight, whatever happens, if I get an audience with the king, I'm going to invite him and Haman. And so this was premeditated. This was intentional. This was her plan. I don't believe she got in and said, oh, by the way, bring Haman. This was something that was planned. She'd rehearsed it, and this is what she's going to do. And bring the number 1 and the number 2 in the kingdom to the banquet. That shouldn't really cause any alarms. It shouldn't show up any flags saying, well, why are you inviting this person or this person or this person? It's the king and the prime minister. And that's who's coming to the banquet. And then it says in verse number 6, at the banquet of wine. And this is what gets a little confusing, especially with the commentators. And I listen to them for counsel, not necessarily for doctrine. And so if I give you my interpretation of this and you don't like it, that's okay. Because we can only go with what the text says. At the banquet of wine. Generally, and we saw this in the first chapter, that there was days and days and days of banquet and revelry, and then there was plenty of wine. And we concluded at that point that there's meals and wine all the time. Now remember, this is earlier. I can't say it's earlier in the day. I'm supposing again that it's midday. It's not the evening because everybody goes home to come back tomorrow. So it was early enough in the day that everybody goes home. They have a chance to, and you'll see Haman gathering his family and friends and giving a report. And then there's time, obviously for the king to dream in chapter 6. And so this is probably midday, mid-afternoon, something like that. So it might have been, although it said banquet of wine, it might have been just like I described a few moments ago. This is that afternoon, the tea party kind of thing. Although most everybody in this culture would serve wine with the finger foods and what. So this wasn't like a wine banquet where you're testing 15 different kinds of wine. We need not think of it like it's only wine. It's just not a meal, or it doesn't appear to be like a feast like we saw in chapter 1. And even in chapter 3, when Esther was queen, they made a big feast for her. So this is more that intimate, probably the three of them and servants. There might have been one or two, but we don't know. So anyway, and then the king, and now this is the second time. If you'll notice, this is the second time. Now he's ready to ask her. It's not like the queen says, "Oh, and by the way, you asked me what I wanted." It's probably protocol for the king to make the request again. I'm guessing, I don't know. After the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition?" Again, "It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to the half of the kingdom it shall be done." Again, is that exaggeration? Is it hyperbole? Is it really that he would give her the half? It's basically whatever you wish. And I'll use the terms kind of loosely, kind of appropriately. I respect you. I know you won't take advantage of me. You're obviously here for a very personal, legitimate reason. You've been my queen for 5 years. You've not tried to take advantage of me. What do you want? What can I do for you? Did I put sweetheart on there? What do you want, dear? Whatever you want, my dear. And again, what does she say? Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and my request is this." So she's like, "God, you actually came, and you actually stayed, and you actually asked me, and you brought Haman with you. How about coming back tomorrow for the feast? Let's do this again. Let me have some more time to better prepare for you." And it says here, "If I have found favor in the sight of the king," in other words, "King, I know it's entirely up to you." That's what you call sweet talking or smoothing them a little bit, stroking them, giving them. So we all have been guilty of that, maybe not to the extreme like it might be interpreted here, but "If it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I've prepared for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Again, it goes back to, she's had 3 days to get ready for the ask. And so, not knowing if she was going to be invited in, she's prepared an intermediate event to kind of get them away and to get them, where it's kind of like it's on her turf. It's not in the palace. Come on over to my house and let me entertain you and engage you and show you my servitude. And if it please the king, come back tomorrow and then I'll make my request known. And apparently, the king's okay with that. Oh, I get to see the queen 2 days in a row. So Haman, Dave.
I think there's another angle on this as well.
Okay.
What she's done is really, really clever, because what she is going to ask the king to do is to nullify an edict that has been issued under the authority of the king with his seal, which kings don't do. It's like, you know, you mean I made a wrong decision? And so she doesn't march into the court and blurt out her requests to embarrass him in front of everybody that's in the court. And by having the first banquet, she has created the scenario where the king says, up to half my, you know, do whatever you want, in front of Haman, who is apparently wasn't there in the courtyard. So now when she's going to get around to the request, she set everything up so that it doesn't embarrass him, and then Haman understands the relationship that the queen has. Because otherwise, if she had blurted it out, Haman could have pulled the king aside and said, look, you don't want to do that, you did this, and wrote it, and she has set it up where he's not going to have a chance to do that at all.
Yes. The only flaw in your argument is that the king can't cancel the decree, but he will issue a second decree. But yes, absolutely. It's put the king in a position where it's almost like he can only side with me with what I need without it being, you know, sometimes you got to be careful what you ask for. You might actually get it. And so she got the second interview, basically. And the second interview is where she's going to make the ask. Go ahead.
I mean, I agree with David. She's shrewd, and
Yeah.
and we've got a king here, and everyone I'm sure knows it who deals with him. Instant gratification. This guy's on top of his game. Everything's been going great for him. He's now got a second in command to kind of do the dirty work, and it's instant gratification. And she's coming in showing everyone she's not calling the king out. She's submitting to the king, which changes which, you know, gets everybody off the defensive. So, and then along with the whole, call it sexuality, the tension, just, you know,
Yes.
putting
Create
the bait out there and moving it a little closer, making it a fun game for this king who loves instant gratification and loves something. He probably has a very predictable life, and so this is kind of fun. This is good. What's she gonna do? She's kneeled to me. She's submitting. She wants me to wait. He's probably like, you know, and probably Haman too. They're probably, what's coming next? They're like excited.
Well, you're going to
about
see him
this.
report that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like they're all like, she's got them, instead of wondering what she's up to, they're like, whoa, this is going to be something, you know. So
Again, Esther, I guess a good word would be shrewd, in that she creates the longing. Remember, it's been 30 plus days, and here's this immediacy, this almost a get acquainted. Remember how beautiful I am? I mean, she's not saying that, but she says, you chose me for a reason. There was something about me that attracted you to me, and although there's been days and weeks apart, just reminding you that I am capable. Here's a capable woman, and she's proving that she's hosted this event, and she's going to do, and call it quote unquote the play. I don't know. I mean, there's other places in the Bible where we see events exactly like that. So this doesn't say that, but it seems to lend to the fact that she wants him to long for her overnight. And he'll be more apt to do exactly what she asks for because she's created that attraction again, or reacquainted that. So that's absolutely. But now the plot changes to Haman a little bit. You know, the king's good. And we'll see that the king's not so good when we get to chapter 6, verse number 1. He's having a restless night. But now look at Haman. Look at Haman. This is a man who is second in command, has the signet ring, actually issued the decree. The king said, you write whatever you want. And the king didn't even say, bring it back and I'll sign it. He says, you can sign it. And you can stamp it as if the king signed it. So And we'll talk a little bit about this in chapter 6. I'm not so sure the king really knew the extent of the decree because he trusted Haman to do it. And so Haman's got all this power, all this prestige, even the honor that is due a prime minister, except for one person, the stick in his craw. You know, the one who jabs him continuously. That's how Haman sees it. This lowly servant has been elevated to a position where now he sits in the king's gate, and I have to see him regularly, and he refuses to bow to me every day. This is the guy. This is the one guy that just, I can't get past him. I can't even go in another gate because I have to go in this gate because I'm royalty. I can't go in the back door to avoid him. I got to go in this way. Or else he would have to humble himself maybe to go in a second entrance. I'm just going to go right in here, and then he sees Mordecai, and he's just furious. The New King James says indignation. I think, what did I put on here? One translation said filled with rage, which is what we understand that's going on with Haman. And here it is. He went out that day joyful with a glad heart. Pride big as a house. Probably had to turn sideways just to get his head through the gate. You know, he's big shot. Look at this. I was invited to the queen's banquet. I was invited to the queen's banquet. I was invited to the queen's banquet. Oh, yeah, the king's coming too. It's kind of how it sounds. That's Haman's report. Oh, yeah, with the king. I've been invited with the king. And we're going back tomorrow too. But that Mordecai, I'm just so furious. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. But when Haman got home, what did he do? He called his wife into the room, called his friends into the room, and what did he tell them that they didn't already know? You know people like this? I know people like this. Nobody in this building, nobody tonight, nobody on Sunday, but I know people like this. That every chance they get, they tell you everything about themselves as if you've never heard it before. Day after day after day after month after year. Seems I could tell the story better than they could. They leave out some of the good parts when they tell it the 100th time. That's Haman. And all I can think of is not to be disparaging, especially to the people I'm talking about, but some people don't have enough self-confidence, don't have enough, I'll say courage to be themselves. They always want to be somebody else. I think Haman wanted to be somebody else. He knew who he was, but he wanted to be somebody else. And it's not necessarily the big shot thing. He just probably didn't like himself very much. Usually that's what happens. So they not only tell you, but that's to build them up because he's so put down. Why won't Mordecai bow to me? And it just reminds them potentially what's going on the inside, not necessarily what's going on the outside. And so they need to go somewhere and be built back up. And when we see this in the world, it's not always in conversation. It's drugs, sex, alcohol, anything that's a diversion away from who I am to be something else. And that's unfortunate, but that's Haman. And he's second in command. He's the prime minister. So he calls his wife and he tells them all about his riches and his multitude of children and all that the king has done to promote him and how he's advanced him above all the officials and the servants of the king. And moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come with the king to the banquet she's prepared, and tomorrow I'm again invited by her along with the king. You see, the king's going back and I'm going with him. No, that's not Haman, but that's okay. I say okay because he's true to himself. I mean, obviously he needs to get better, but He's consistent. And evidently, then his wife and all of his friends said to him, what? Remember, I think I wrote it down, maybe I didn't. We just got to be careful who we seek our counsel from. He didn't necessarily ask for advice, but evidently his wife and maybe the friends, they've been, this is bothering Haman so much, what are we going to do? How can we help him? Well, let's figure out how to get rid of Mordecai. Okay, so maybe they came up with a plan, and here's that plan. And I found something interesting today, and we'll talk about that in just a second about this, because Bert asked me about it last week. Yes, somebody?
Negative people typically look for their audience and yes men, who's going to build them up and help them be negative and carry it to the next level. And that's exactly what Haman did. They're not just listening; they're egging him on. Yeah, let's do this. Let's make it even worse.
Yeah, let's make it even worse. Yeah. On the outline, I put down at the very bottom, number G2A. This is that snowball effect. As each day it's got to get stronger, it's got to get harder, it's got to get more forceful, and it just keeps rolling and rolling and rolling, and everything that's been going on with Haman and Mordecai and the events, and to this point we still don't know. Haman probably still doesn't know, because it's going to be reported later, that Mordecai is related to, obviously, to Esther. Now, they know he's a Jew because he reported, so I can't bow because I'm a Jew. And we'll see that in chapter 6. That'll start playing out a little bit more in the next chapter. So it's just Mordecai. It's not necessarily his heritage per se, other than when we talked about the tribe that Haman's from versus the tribe that Mordecai's from, and there might be historical contentions. It's just this guy just won't play. Mordecai won't play with Haman. And like you said, the yes men, those that would coddle him and even support his ego, and that's who he surrounds himself with, and Mordecai's just not playing. So evidently the wife's heard this story more than once, right? Our wives are our best sounding board. I don't know what we'd do without them, right, fellas? Amen. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him. So this was a consensus. Somehow it looks like it's all together. Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Now, Bert come to me last night, he says, how tall is this ceiling? And I said, I don't know, it's probably 50 feet. This is Bert, 38 feet. I'm like, yeah, it's probably 38 feet. Either he knows that, or being an architect, he can look at it and just say, yeah, it's 38 feet. So he knows it's 38 feet tall. All right, so whatever, the plot thickens, all right? So then he says, imagine the gallows twice as tall as the ceiling. And it was built overnight. So it didn't happen that way. I mean, I'm not discrediting the text, but the gallows, it says, where does it say about the gallows? Let a gallows be made, and in the morning suggested the king, and the gallows. So he had the gallows made. Now remember, what's going to happen is going to happen the next day. So they didn't just make a 75-foot gallows overnight, I suspect. So I did some digging, and finally one commentator decided to offer a suggestion, and it's plausible. If you have a structure that's already 75 feet high, generally what it takes to get to the top of that could be done overnight, like a ladder, right? Or some kind of a scaffolding, or some kind of instrument to get whatever needs to get up 75 feet high. Don't ask me how the commentator knows this. And I'm offering it as a suggestion so that sometimes we don't have to just sit there and spin our wheels about this gallows thing being 75 feet high. He suggested that where in that region, the trees would grow 100 foot tall very easily. And it would have been a real possibility, a real timeline possibility that somewhere on Haman's property was a tree that tall, and they took them up to a limb, and that's where they were going to, make the gallows up there, So take it for what it's worth. It satisfied me because, how do you do that overnight? I mean, that's a lot of people doing a lot of work, and it still may not be true, but Gary Dave has a comment, and I think we'll probably get 2 or 3 suppositions, and I'm okay with that. Go ahead, Tyler.
You're talking about gallows. Because the version I'm looking at says a pole reaching that high to impale him on, rather than like hanging.
That's the definition. That's the English definition of whatever that word should be. Some instrument for lifting someone up and putting them to death. They did impale in those days, yes.
Okay, because when I hear gallows, I think of hanging.
Right.
So, there's a
And
little
that's
difference
so.
there.
But we'll see it in chapter 8, I think it is.
Neither one of them very pleasant.
Neither one.
One, I was going to make the point, I was guessing 35 feet, so
Were you?
I feel
Yeah,
pretty satisfied.
So you've done drawings too.
But I guess the image that comes to mind to me is you think about every Western you've ever seen with a gallows in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's always raised up and high where everybody can see.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not, take that Mordecai out back alley, beat him up, kill him if you have to, and we'll just make him go away. It's, no, I not only want to kill him, I want to do it in front of everybody so that everybody knows that I did it.
Yeah, just remember, this wasn't Haman's idea, though. So he's surrounded himself with an entourage that thinks just like he does, at least in this respect. Whatever we do needs to be a public event. Everybody needs to see it. And the king's going to let us do it because the king's going to say yes. Anybody else? Okay. Chapter 5. Come to the feast, getting up the courage, the preparation, the invitation, the promise of the fasting is, can I even get an audience with the king? So we don't know what Esther was praying for. We don't know what she was fasting for. The goal was to get an audience with the king and to get him to somehow do something about this decree. That was the motivation. We're all going to die, Esther, if you don't do something. A monumental task for a young person. Because we even supposed in chapter 2, when she was appointed, that she was in her mid-20s, maybe even younger than that, maybe teen to 20. And we're only about 5 years removed. So when we think about the awesome responsibility of a 25-year-old praying to God, help me save my people. Or use me as your instrument to save my people. I wasn't baptized until I was 25. I didn't know a whole lot about God and prayer and providence till mid-30s. And I'm just now figuring out about praise and the idea of prayer being that which is truly an intimate approach to God at 60 years old. Just now figuring some of those things out. She had to figure them out on the fly. But remember, I didn't become a Christian until 25. I don't know about you, but how was Esther raised? This is going to be one of those long questions at the end of chapter 10. What was Esther's heritage? Who raised her? What do we know about that? She honored him. She even revered him. Anything he said, she was willing to do. And it got her to a point where people began to recognize her at a young age. She was probably honorable, obviously the beauty might open the door, but it's the honor, the integrity, the dignity that allowed her to come in. Now, with King in chapter 5, it was probably just her beauty that got her through the door. But what got her to that place, what even got her to the point where this has happened and she's been given the ask, and it would have been real easy at 25 years old to say, you know, this isn't for me. I can't do this. She did say that. But Mordecai's comment, maybe you're here for right now. Maybe you're supposed to be doing this. You're the only one that can do it. And so she spent 3 days considering that. And what we see in chapter 5 is the courage to walk through those doors and to approach the king, knowing that she might die. And then the contrast to that. Here's somebody that's lived such a selfish life, probably their whole life. But yet they were very political, and they knew how to say the right thing at the right time and stroke the king and get position of authority and make declarations that probably, I don't know, we talked about this in chapter 4. We don't know how much money Haman had, but he was willing to fill the king's coffers if he would just sign or let me sign the paper to kill all these Jews, and we're going to take all that they've got and I'll put it in the king's treasury. You know, everything material, everything superficial is Haman. He's an outside person, not an inside person. Everything about perception. How does the world see me? Instead of what's on the inside and just do the right thing. That's the contrast, and that's what we're looking at in chapter 5. And then I can't say it gets better necessarily. From the story aspect, it gets better. But there's some hard lessons coming up. Really hard stuff. You know, people read Esther and say, oh, that's a great story. It sounds just like something that Warner Brothers would put out. And probably so. But the message inside it is calibrated, and it's scary. Because if we're looking at the Bible as what might benefit us, these things were written that we might believe. They're written so that we might learn and be instructed by God. There's a lesson in here for all of us. You know, which character am I? You know, we might play that game intimately with ourselves. We may never say it out loud. And then we have an opportunity to maybe make some amends and try to figure out how to fix it if we're one of those characters that may not be the most desirable. Chapter 6 opens up with a sleepless night. And we'll look at that next week. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you for our willingness. Father, we cherish every word that you give us. Father, sometimes we might take a little bit of liberty in trying to figure some things out. And some things we can't figure out, and we understand that. By faith, we approach you. Show us, instruct us, raise us up, make us a holy people. Give us the courage to say and do the right things, even when no one is looking. Father, thank you for loving us, even so much that you gave us your Son. A perfect testimony. Father, give us a night's rest. Wake us up to your glory in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. You've been a good class. I do have next week's outline.